Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to this event, which is a partnership between the Open Government Partnership, whose global summit is currently taking place, and the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. My name's Graham Smith. I'm chair of the Knowledge Network, and I'll be running this session. We've got a great panel that I will introduce in a minute. The aim of this session is just to talk a bit about the value of climate assemblies. We're not expecting that people who are on this call necessarily know much about climate assemblies, although I know many do. But the aim of this session is to hear from people in different positions within the political system about why they value climate assemblies and how they think the practice of climate assemblies could be improved. What I want to, just to let you know that we are recording this session, so people's cameras are off. But if you do ask a question and we bring you into the session, then be aware that you will be being recorded. If you have questions or comments at any time, please put them in the chat and we'll try and bring them to the panel. So the idea is that I'll give a short introduction to climate assemblies. We'll have a panel discussion and then gather and ask a set of questions which the panel will respond to. So just very briefly, and just to make sure that everybody in the room is up to date and up to speed. So what is a climate assembly? What is it that we're talking about here? And a very simple definition is that a climate assembly brings together a randomly selected group of everyday people to learn, deliberate and make recommendations on aspects of the climate crisis. So this is a group of people who would not normally be involved in the political process, who are selected in order to ensure a diversity of social perspectives and different positions within society. They are provided with expert input. They're provided with input from advocates and people with lived experience. They have time to deliberate about that evidence, and they come to recommendations. This is part of a broader set of deliberative processes and other kinds of citizens' assemblies, but these have been a set of practices which have really mushroomed over recent years, and particularly tellingly at the national level. The first time a citizens' assembly dealt with climate was in the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland back in 2016, I think it was, sorry. And since then, we've seen a series of assemblies, first of all in France, and then in the United Kingdom, more recently in Scotland, and still ongoing in Denmark, where national governments have established large and significant climate assemblies. We've also seen more recently in Germany, the establishment of a climate assembly by a civil society organization to try and put pressure on the federal elections and then on the coalition agreements. And then recently, we've seen the emergence of a global assembly. So while we've seen assemblies happen over a number of years, they've really caught the imagination in relation to climate change in the last 2, 3 or 4 years. I think if you'd asked me a few years ago, would this happen? I would have said this was very unlikely, but actually we've seen a whole set of experiences which really kind of seriously change the dynamics of citizen engagement in this area. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would like to invite the members of the panel forward. And I don't know if Jane is able to spotlight people, but I'd like to introduce 4 people who have very different positions within the political system. I've got Uffe Elbæk with me, who's from Denmark, who was really a significant player in promoting the Danish Climate Assembly, which is still ongoing. I've got Susie Townend, who is the lead of the Secretariat from the Scottish Climate Assembly. I've got Erica Hope, who is the Director of the Climate Planning and Laws Division within the European Climate Foundation, who have been responsible for providing funding for climate assemblies, but also for civil society organizations who are trying to advocate for or evaluate climate assemblies. And last but not least, I've got Susan Lee, who wasn't advertised, but has joined us, and I'm really glad she's joined us, who's an activist involved in the Global Assembly. And we thought it'd be really interesting to bring in that perspective as well. And she's also from the host country as well of the summit, and is joining us very late at night. So I really appreciate, or very, very early in the morning, really appreciate that, Susan. So the first question I'm going to ask my colleagues here is this question about what is it that they value? Why do they think that climate assemblies are valuable? What is it they value about these processes? And I'm going to start with Uffe. So what is it that you value so much about assemblies that you actually advocated one within the Danish political system?
Thanks for the question. And it's actually a very deep question with many aspects. But to answer, hopefully quite short, is that the way our democratic institutions today works, they have obvious problems coming up with solutions to the problems we are facing. Not because that politicians are bad politicians, but the way the whole democratic institutions has been built, there's a pattern that us elected politicians, we have a very short time perspective up to the next election. Just because of that, for example, I love the Citizens Assembly because they don't think about, first of all, party politics. They are selected as citizens. They have a long-term perspective when they are coming up with their recommendations. So there's a lot of reasons why I think that that Citizens Assembly is one of some of the most important tools to face the challenge we are seeing right now. And it's not only because an issue like climate change, but all kinds of issues we are facing, like the immigrant crisis or unemployment or et cetera, et cetera. So I can only see good arguments for why we should use Citizens Assembly as one of the most important democratic tools to come up with the right solutions.
So for you, as someone who's actually deeply embedded within the political system, who has played a role as a political representative, you actually recognise there are certain dysfunctionalities within the system with which you think assemblies could respond effectively to.
Exactly, and we have to understand that our present democratic institutions, and now I'm speaking from a Northern European position, and I know that the reality is very different from Scandinavia if you go to India or China or Latin America, but so I'm speaking from a Scandinavian position. And even if Scandinavian is highly functioned democratic societies, still here in Denmark and Sweden and Norway, we see that the democratic institutions are under pressure. And we can see that there are less and less people who want to be a member of a political party. Before, the political parties really had a common ground and mirrored the diversity in our societies. But today it's only up to 4% of the Danish population who thinks it's meaningful to be part of a political party. And that, in a way, also has an effect on the diversity, a lack of diversity in the parliament as so. And that's one of the really strong sides of Citizens Assembly, that they mirror the diversity in society and can come up with other important perspectives to specific issues. So the dilemma we are facing right now, seen from my position as Member of Parliament, is that on one hand, we have to stand up for our democratic institutions, and at the same time, we have to vitalize them and develop them. One of the tools we can develop our democratic institutions and vitalize them is through citizens' assembly. And the next step is, and that's my final word to your question. The next step, in my opinion, is that in 1954, we decided to only have one chamber in the Danish parliament. Up to then, we had the same system as UK, that you had the House of Lords and House of Commons. And we closed House of Lords in Denmark. But I think that we should use the Citizens' Assembly idea to actually create a new chamber parallel to the present House of Commons, and have a House of Citizens. That's the next step.
But you've answered my next question, actually, but I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you with that, because that's a radical suggestion. But I think there'll be some appreciation in the audience for that, I think. So Susie is, I've mentioned, is from the Scottish Climate Assembly Secretariat. She leads and has done an amazing job there, and is on a bit of a high today, because the Scottish government has produced what I can only describe as an extensive response to the Scottish Climate Assembly. And Susie, I can imagine you will be spending your whole Christmas reading this, but it's really impressive. But you don't need to necessarily talk about, we can talk about that later, but you're someone who's spent the last, I don't know, almost last year living and breathing climate assemblies. So I'm really interested, and someone who comes from a civil service background as well. So I'm interested, what is it for you that is valuable for climate? What is it that brings value for climate assemblies?
Thank you very much, Graham. And yeah, we're pretty excited and slightly exhausted. So excuse us if I seem rather rambling today. Do cut across me if you need me to finish. I guess there are three things that I thought about when you said, why are they valuable? So the first thing is around, and I think what Uffe was talking about as well, around what sort of society do you want to be? And Scotland is also quite consensual, and in terms of the way we make policy as civil servants, we conduct quite a lot of consultations, but consultations are quite limited because people who are interested engage with consultation. It isn't the same as you would get from an assembly. And so it really is a much broader and deeper and very different sort of consultation. And I think for a civil servant, that is very valuable. And that ability to be part of a society where democratic muscle is what one of our colleagues talks about, is being flexed, I think gives civil servants a lot of credibility in the work that they're doing. The second thing I was going to say is that, certainly for climate change, we are going to have to make pretty big changes as societies in order to tackle climate change. And I think when you're making big choices, whether as an elected politician or as an official advising a politician, to have the sort of cover and consensus that comes from having had an assembly to make recommendations allows you to be much more ambitious than you perhaps otherwise would. So I think particularly for climate, because of the nature of the discussion, it's having an assembly to inform the process is really valuable. And the third thing that I just want to say very briefly is that I think that the policies that you make through consulting with people in the kind of considered way that you have in an assembly result in much better policy, because people know their situation better than, as a civil servant, many of my civil servants have a very similar background to I do. And so you sit in a bit of a bubble within politics. And I think it's really useful to have that different perspective that comes from an assembly, that you get much richer, much better informed, and perhaps you don't make as many mistakes as well, that you don't have policies that have unintended consequences because you've had a chance to talk it through with people that will be directly impacted and have a very different lived experience to you do. So those are the three things that I guess I would say that are, so very, I guess coming at it from quite a similar perspective to Uffe as a politician, but as a civil servant supporting politicians, I guess our thinking is quite similar.
Okay, and do you, I'm just interested to get the sense in which, do you think that other civil servants who haven't had the experience that you've had recognise that, or do you feel that actually it's only through your experience that you've come to realise this?
It's a good question. I think a lot of civil servants do appreciate it, and certainly my experience from what I've seen in Scotland is that because the politicians have said they were serious about engaging with us, then that has meant that the officials have been serious. And generally speaking, people are serious about what the public think, but sometimes it's quite hard to know what the wider public think. And so perhaps for some it's more instinctive than others. But I think particularly if you have a strong steer from politicians, then officials will try to accommodate what people want.
Okay, that's really great. Thanks, Susie. Erica, I'm turn to you now, because you've actually your organisation and actually you, but your organisation has put a lot of money and resources behind this, not least behind the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, but also to specific assemblies and to activists who are prone. So what is it that you, from your position sitting within a philanthropic organisation, value about these spaces?
Thanks, Graham. I should clarify, it's not my money that we've put into this. But no, I mean, I think there's really a number of ways that they can be very valuable, demonstrated to different degrees in different places. But I should stress at the beginning, I think in all cases, it's not guaranteed that you get these outcomes. And that relates to, I think, what we're going to discuss about later. You need certain conditions and so on in place to make sure that happens. But I think, first of all, the very fact of having assemblies is a step to make climate actions and climate policy seem more accessible and something that ordinary people can engage around, rather than being something sort of remote and technocratic that's only for experts. And I think, as both Uffe and Susie have implied, we're talking about big changes in society now. We can't just be in the realm of things that happen upstream that politicians can do without people really being affected by it. So it's just not right not to engage people in thinking about those questions. And actually, if we're trying to promote the idea of greater public involvement in policymaking in general, climate's also a high profile topic to sort of get that idea infused into society. I think also the recommendations themselves that come from assemblies, I agree, can be really, really helpful. Sometimes they can be quite innovative and put issues on the table that weren't necessarily there. I suppose I'm thinking about the French promotion of the ecocide law, or the sort of overhaul of the governance arrangements in Ireland that happened after that assembly, and surface issues like the connection between nature and climate that hasn't, perhaps been so much of a part of discourse as it should be. And in other cases, maybe the proposals are things that have been around for a while, but the assemblies help to kind of normalise them, or make governments feel more comfortable to put in place things that they might have otherwise thought were a bit too radical or whatever. And potentially give some international exposure to more far-reaching ideas like the French proposal to ban short-haul flights received quite a lot of media attention in the UK, for example. There's also the fact that the assemblies can be quite a transformative experience for the people who take part. We've seen lots of examples of people becoming local councillors or spokespeople or changing their job or activists in different ways. And I think there's work to do in exploring how you can support people in doing that after their sort of assembly journey, but it's a potentially important mechanism. And I think finally, well, I mean, there's lots to say, but the other thing I wanted to mention is I think assemblies are sparking really quite important and honest conversations and reflections on really key questions like how we talk about climate and how democracy functions. Things like, is it reasonable to present people with really wide open, massive questions like how should the country reach net zero? Or is it better to break the question down and in what ways, and what information and what formats give the best chance for people from different backgrounds and different walks of life being able to engage? And then also, what is the role of deliberation and citizen participation alongside representative democracy? How can we link up different channels of civic engagement, like social movements and assemblies, and just generally kind of contribute to a culture shift in how democracy functions? And I have to say, I'm really happy that Knoca is here to help us consider all these questions in a nice structured way that also helps us to connect the conclusions that we might reach with sort of practical best practice and implementation and so on, so that it's not just in the realms of delicious academic debate. So yeah.
I just say nothing wrong with delicious academic debate, but so I'm kind of interested, if I could push you a little bit, Erica, on ECF as an organization whose priority is ensuring, is trying to ensure robust climate governance, has made that decision to put some of its energy into this space. Was that quite a difficult thing to persuade other colleagues that is the right thing to do, or actually were they open to this particular approach to dealing with climate?
Interesting question. I would say ECF has been, over a period of time, moving from a sort of more technical organisation to also quite a political organisation. And I think in a way that parallels where we're at in the transition. As I was saying, there's been various emissions reductions we could make just by, changing the fuel source for electricity production. And obviously that does bring important political questions, but we're more and more now reaching into the lives of ordinary people. I think therefore it's becoming an increasingly inescapable fact that you need to include people much more carefully in decisions, and also consider very carefully the sort of social ramifications of the changes that we're talking about. And I don't think any of us think we really have the answer yet completely as to how to do that. So when we started, me and some colleagues sort of started talking about assemblies as a promising model to explore for this, I think everybody was quite keen to give it a go, in a sense. And obviously we also had the ECF CEO who got very directly involved in the French Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat, and that was another sort of source of interest for the organisation. But I do notice in general in the climate movement there's a lot of talk about the importance of social justice and the importance of citizen engagement, but I think we're still not quite clear exactly on how best to do that. So it's a sort of exploratory place, which is partly why we set up Knoca, because we wanted to really make sure that we actually do and contribute to the sort of real advancing of understanding and practice about that. Thanks,
Erica. That's really helpful. Susan, if I could just turn to you, you've dedicated yourself over the last few months to a really incredible project of trying to do a climate assembly on a global basis. So at the base of this must be some sort of commitment from yourself to this as a mode of engagement. So what for you is the value of a climate assembly?
Thanks, Graham. So I can try to pick up on some of the other excellent points that were made earlier, but I'm joining you from what you describe as the first global citizens assembly, right, with participants selected by sortition. And I think just to pick up on this idea of diversity that's been surfaced, honestly, after our experiences this year, there hasn't for me been a better masterclass in this value of diversity, right? That as this byproduct of stratified sortition, we're able to pull in an unprecedented diversity of people who are sitting at the table and co-creating solutions together. And so to give a bit of context, the 100 members who are part of this year's Global Assembly are forming the first attempt at comprising a descriptive sample of what the world looks like and using sortition as a tool to do this. You're talking about what happens when a group of 100 people who are coming from 49 countries, of whom only 60 are fully literate, with backgrounds, ranging from anywhere between physicists to gold miners to foresters and dressmakers or goat herders even. This is a stark departure from what decision-making bodies we expect to look like at the global level. And while there are a number of ways in which I think we can highlight this value of diversity, I just want to pick up on this point that Susie has mentioned about this need to consider trade-offs and buy-ins. And I think this idea of peer-to-peer learning that I want to highlight encapsulates a number of different sort of benefits, if you will, metrics of diversity, whether that's bringing in a diversity of lived experiences or cognitive diversities or different knowledges. I think the strength that we've really seen this year through the Global Assembly is the possibility of peer-to-peer learning that's only made possible by this diversity, and which then leads to never before seen trade-offs. And, you know, for instance, we're talking about participants from what we would call global north countries who are high consumers of energy, learning from a peer participant on the same Zoom call, though many UTC hours apart, sharing that he is a miner, a gold miner whose livelihood relies on fossil fuels, yet he still wants us to transition, not only because his town's water supply is directly contaminated by his occupation and his livelihood, but because he's learned throughout this process and from discussion with his peers that about this urgency of the climate crisis. So I think one thing we've really learned is that global deliberation with authentic diversity that mirrors the global population provides this avenue for sort of members of the global family to learn from each other and reach unprecedented consensus. And I think just to pick up on this point quickly, that's surfacing around governance and process, right? So focusing on the process in addition to the policies and topics. And I think one point that I want to bring up is that in the post-COP deliberations we've had in the Global Assembly, our members are increasingly sort of surfacing, and I want to say elevating these questions of governance, right? After having observed, for instance, the Blue Zone negotiations at COP in Glasgow, implicitly comparing their experiences in the participation of the Global Assembly process to the kinds of decision-making processes that they see at the global level. And I think one of the greatest learning journeys of climate assemblies may not just be the expert inputs, but also, right, this experience of participation itself that is then sparking activation. So it's this meta learning, if you will, when we as process designers are able to design processes that really authentically uplift and center participants and sort of communicates to them, many of them for the first time in their lives, that their voice matters and that their voice must be included institutionally in the process of decision making, that it inspires a lived transformation that is then sort of organically reflected into the sorts of recommendations that they put forward about the need to change and address governance, as opposed to sort of offering up prescriptive policies in the recommendations of climate assemblies.
Susan, that's really really interesting, really profound. I'm going to ask you the follow-up question that I was going to ask everybody, and then I'll go around the other way, which is that, so you've established this global assembly, and you might want to reflect on that or others, but what is it that you think we need to do to kind of increase the impact of climate assemblies to actually, you know, so that we're actually vitalizing and democratizing climate governance? What is it you would like to see change? Or what do we need to, or what do we as climate assembly advocates need to be pushing for?
Yeah, I think I want to return again to this point about governance and the point that, you know, the forms of democracy that we see now and that we must continue to protect are really just one iteration, right, of what is possible in this bigger scope of democracy. And, you know, speaking to the global level, our project is really, I think, arising from this understanding that the climate crisis is a symptom of the governance crisis. And this governance crisis is one that fails to tap into, let's say, the capacity and agency that exists in the human family. And therefore, I think it's fundamentally impoverishing us and ourselves of what each of us has to offer. And so just speaking on behalf of the Global Assembly, right, our long-term vision is to be able to build infrastructure of global governance and to create a node that exists alongside sort of these other nodes of global governance, be it COP or the World Economic Forum, that can permanently and institutionally bring civic intelligence to the fore. And, you know, like any other decision-making infrastructure, we now consider the Global Assembly to be in session. It's not a campaign or a one-off event. Rather, the members will continue to iterate upon their declaration, and even after their sessions end, continue to stay involved in a sort of alumni role in the extent that they want to. So I think the point that I'm trying to make, Graham, is the focus that needs to be placed on the process and the need to build infrastructure, at least globally, that after over 75 years since what we now call this Bretton Woods moment, we need to recognize as process designers that we are not at the end of history, that now is very much a second Bretton Woods moment, if you will. And I think the homework of our generation is to be able to curate these new institutions and infrastructures that can hold and do justice to the solutions that we can bring to the table. And citizens' assemblies really fit into this picture as a tool out of perhaps many other participatory fora that we can leverage to realize this vision.
I think it's really interesting when you're talking about not thinking of these things as sort of one-off, but thinking of what an infrastructure would look like, which I think I'm going to go back to Uffe, which kind of fits in with what you were saying, but in the Danish situation of trying to institutionalize these as a more usual part of politics. Was that where you were ending up with where you were talking about thinking of them in relation to a second chamber?
Yeah, exactly. And I was really inspired by what you said, Susan, concerning a global perspective and all the learnings you have already gathered from your global assembly. I'm really, really inspired. Thank you for that. I would say to everyone here listening, I think that we are in a very vulnerable situation seen as a civilization, because the crisis we're facing, and not, as I said in the beginning, not only the climate crisis, but also the inequality crisis, happens at the same time that many of our democratic institutions and structures are weakened. When we get the figures from, for example, Freedom House, the latest report, it's only around 8% of the Earth's population who are living in a full function democracy, and you can even question that. But it's really some tough figures we get on the table these days. During the COVID crisis last year, we've seen a setback. Around 88 nations have seen a democratic setback. Only one nation has seen a development in the democratic culture, and all the rest is status quo. And I think that we need that perspective when we're talking about assemblies, and in this case, climate assemblies, that this is so needed and we have to understand that our democratic institutions, we have to develop them and strengthen them. And one tool to that, it's not the only one, but one tool is a citizens' assembly. And personally, I'm pushing every day in the Danish Parliament that we can figure out how to develop our understanding about our democratic institutions, and really understand that we need a much stronger bottom-up involvement. And the institutions as we have today was built in the past, and in a situation where you had large-scale political engagements behind the different political parties, and in this case, most places it's top-down and it's money-driven, and it's so far away from the normal understanding about what a living and dynamic democratic culture is. So I think that the time is right for citizens' assemblies. Should I say it like that?
Yeah, thanks, Uffe. Susie, I almost dare not ask you, because the idea that there might be more to do that after you've finished such a long, or not finished, you're coming towards the end of a really long process. Or maybe it's actually the start. That's an interesting question, actually. But someone who's been through a process like this and is now trying to leverage impact of an assembly, what do you think needs to be in place for citizens' assemblies and climate assemblies in particular to actually enhance their contribution to climate governance?
Yeah, so maybe it's good just to reflect on where we've got to. So we've got to the point today where the government response has been sent back to the Assembly members. And I think the fact that we have had a government response, that we were legally required to have a government response, is really significant and was important. Other assemblies have had a government response, but it hasn't been a legal requirement that it happen. And so we don't need to feel particularly grateful that we've had the response. It was always the intention that we would have the response. And I'm pleased that it is a substantive response, and it looks to have been a very kind of serious response. But it was absolutely the requirement that there should be a response. And now our Assembly members will be told about the response, and they will come together in what we're calling Weekend 8 in February to think about what they think about the government response, and then they will have a chance to say something back to government about what government has responded. And so there has been a bit of dialogue that the members have said something to government has got away and thought about it, and now members get a chance to understand what has been said and to say what they think about that. But that, at the moment, the intention is that's kind of the end point as far as the members are concerned. And I think there is a question around how do we support those members that want to carry on, to be involved, because some of the recommendations, in fact, probably most of the recommendations that the Assembly members made cannot be implemented immediately. And in some cases, we've said by 2030, we want this to happen. So who will say at 2030, has government kept its word, even where government has said, yes, we accept the recommendation, we're going to do what you say, who's going to do that? And for me, I guess there are two kind of obvious groups of people that can do that. The first is the Assembly members themselves, and how do we support those who want to continue to be active and to be engaged with the response, and enable them to make clear whether they're happy or not happy with how things are progressing. And then the second is, because we have had the benefit of being so embedded within a parliamentary process, that for me has been incredibly valuable, because it means that after Weekend 8, we have had a commitment that the government minister who's responsible for Net Zero will come to the Scottish Parliament, will make a statement, and will take questions. And so there is a process of parliamentary scrutiny. The Scottish Parliament Committee that covers Net Zero has already heard from our members and Children's Parliament members who were part of our process about what their expectations were and what their hopes were for the response. And so I think part of what we have to do in the remaining time that we have left is to think about who is going to carry on that process of watching over the recommendations as they're followed through or not followed through, and holding this government, but also subsequent governments, to account. And I think there's one thing very briefly to say in terms of what the government response said. I was quite struck that they listed a whole lot of things which they were going to do in response to the Assembly, which is great. But they also said that their intention was that the Assembly recommendations would inform future policy making. And I think it's something to do with the Assembly. Yes, it's produced a whole lot of recommendations of this moment, but it's also set a tone and a direction and an ambition for what they want for the future. And so even if there isn't a specific recommendation for 5 years' time or 6 years' time, it's possible for politicians and policymakers to look at the recommendations that came out of this Assembly and see what the ambition was, and therefore that to inform future policy development. And I think that is incredibly encouraging, actually, in terms of that kind of future governance, but making sure that there is a mechanism to continue to hold everybody to account for future action, I think is really important. And I guess that brings me to the kind of final point, which is around how you involve the public, the wider public, in these processes. And I think I would say that's quite hard, that I'm not sure that anybody has successfully really engaged the wider public in a really deep way, except perhaps with the exception of the French situation. But elsewhere, there hasn't been that really wide public engagement. And there's a question around how much that really matters, I think, because if it's informing policy development anyway, then maybe it matters less, except in terms of transparency and accountability and all the things which are actually incredibly important and provide a lot of the justification for assemblies. And so I think trying to get that balance between really engaging with policymakers and those that are part of the political process, but also having an eye to public engagement is, I'm not sure we've quite resolved it.
And interestingly, I think that sort of reflects on what Susan was talking about needing an infrastructure around it. We've been very good at kind of thinking about the input side of getting citizens to do things, but less about how it lands with public administrations or other institutions. And I think we need to spend much more thinking about that. That's right. I really realise I'm running. This is such an interesting conversation. I've run a bit too far. But Erica, I just want to give you a chance.
Graham, could I just make just a short comment on the last question you raised here, because we start here in Denmark to get some experience about how does all the recommendation land in the traditional established political system. And even if we are not home yet, there are actually already now some good experiences from the first round of recommendation from the Climate Assembly here in Denmark. And the ministries and the Minister for Climate has responded very, very, they take it serious. And they take it even as serious as when they get input from the more industrial-based organizations. So I have to say that it's actually a good story, even if I'm always critical towards my own government. I have to say it's a good story.
Okay.
And I also have to say that both Susie and Susan has underlined the importance of how do we institutionalize the Citizens' Assembly. And in that perspective, we also have to remember that one level is a national state level, nation assemblies, but here in Denmark already now we see good examples of how you can use this tool also on city level and local level. So I think we start to actually have some solid experiences in working in this area.
Okay. Erica, I'm just going to ask you the last question about what you think the next step in citizen assembly development needs to be. And then I'm just going to draw on a few of the comments that have been made in order that you can all have a kind of final reflection in relation to the kind of stuff that's been asked in the chat. So Erica, so what would you think?
Thanks. Well, I mean, I fully agree with everything that's been said about needing a political commitment, obviously, to following up assemblies, and also I think there's been some discussion in the chat about needing the assembly to be related to a proper sort of opportunity in the policy cycle, rather than just having recommendations that will sort of float in midair. And you know, the Luxembourg Assembly is going to be looking at the next iteration of its National Energy and Climate Plan. At the other sort of level of governance in the UK, there was an assembly in Devon which was really specifically looking at two topics that were needing input from the local climate plan. So that's, you know, it's important, like Susie said, to have ideally a legal commitment to having to do a follow-up. But we see that there's varying degrees of success in getting that kind of political commitment for different assemblies. And ideally what we want is that shouldn't have to be a kind of one-off thing that is fought for, that it really should be part of a shift to the sort of a culture and practice and infrastructure of actually having this integrated to policy making. So very much in line with what Susan and Uffe were saying. And that may mean it's partly about sort of periodic repetition of deliberative exercises. It's partly about making sure that civil servants and politicians are ready and sort of prepared to pick up on recommendations. But really, I suppose maybe if I'm adding anything new to what's been said, I think that finding the hooks to do these processes regularly is really partly a question of the broader design of climate governance frameworks. So, for example, there's a lot of evidence that having kind of overarching climate framework laws with regular cycles of target setting and plan making, maybe advised on by an independent scientific advisory body, these are very sort of powerful ways of ensuring a vibrant, ongoing political debate about climate and a sort of strong sense of ownership by the government. But also, if you've got those regular cycles of plan making and so on, then, you know, what's to stop you building in a regular moment for citizen input, and then the kind of tools and processes and so on for everybody involved in implementing that to know that that's expected and that should be coming. And ideally, actually, you should build into your overarching climate policy framework levers like access to justice and things like that, so that citizens have the right to intervene in other ways. So yeah, indeed, holding governments to account for their commitments. And all of this is part of the necessary culture shift of having a much more sort of engaged process, I think.
Okay.
And then just one very quick point, if I may, Graham, I think just looking at the assemblies themselves, I think we're learning very much that there's a number of sort of supporting structures and conditions that are needed around the processes to make sure that they're visible and known about and kind of resonant in wider society. So that's things like having proper stakeholder outreach program, you know, measures to raise awareness and understanding of the process among all different stakeholder groups, so parliamentarians, civil society, industry, and so on. Also sort of proper media strategy that's sensitive enough, and then finding enough resource for the follow-up after the assembly sessions. And then also to keep evolving the practice, we obviously need to be researching in a systematic way around the assemblies and evaluating them. And these are all things that ECF is kind of trying to support in our own way, but arguably some of them should be really factored into the formal assembly design and assembly budgets. So
yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, I think that's a good learning, which is that we need to resource these things well in order that they, if we expect, you know, if we want them to play the kind of roles that you're all been talking about, we need to find good resource and invest in democratic infrastructure, which often is overlooked, actually, I think. So I'm just going to pick up a couple of questions or comments from the audience, and I'm going to come back to you and give you all no more than about a minute each, I'm afraid, just to kind of wrap up, and from what you've heard from other people and what your final message to the audience and those who might be watching this is. So from the couple of sort of questions were around two sorts of areas, one about the political system, I guess, and the other around civil society. And Bernard asked a question about whether or not these assemblies need to be given specific responsibilities, and or need to be held accountable. And it's a really interesting question about how we hold to account a group of randomly selected citizens. So we don't have to answer all of these questions. I just think it's useful to air them as statements as well. And Stephanie asked about whether or not the value of these things is really to give sort of political cover for politicians and civil society, rather than actually, you know, to either I'm not sure whether she means cover to kind of not do anything or cover to actually act. It provides an opportunity for that, and are they really a real source of solutions? And, you know, sort of, are they more a kind of a cover, if you like? And then Bernard also asked a question to Erica, I guess she's pushing you about ECF's lobbying for green transition at the same time as kind of like putting support in for these democratic processes. And is there a bit of a tension there for civil society between this kind of desire to see particular outcomes, but also wanting to see a kind of democratic institution helping shape those decisions? And then Kathy Conn raised a really interesting question, which I think we've touched on, which is sort of public awareness and understanding key for these things actually to be seen as legitimate? And it's interesting, Susie said maybe not actually, but it may be the question here about their long-term legitimacy does require that. So There's a bunch of things which have been said from the people who have been listening to you, but I'm also willing for you to respond to something you've heard from someone else in this call. But I'd like to give you each a kind of a minute or so just to sort of reflect on the sort of what do you think what do you want to take out of this conversation? What do you want to take forward in relation to climate assemblies? So if I start with you, Susie.
Thank you. Just on the legitimacy issue, I think it's really important that if we ask people to give up a lot of their time and to engage very seriously with very difficult topics, including climate change, then it's really important that we make a commitment to them from the outset that what they say will be taken seriously. And so I think part of the legitimacy comes not directly from public knowledge of what's happening, but comes from, certainly in our case, the fact that to create an assembly received cross-party unanimous support in the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish parties from all of the parties in the Parliament have continued to engage with us. And so the legitimacy comes from within the political process rather than, and I think it is important that it's known and visible, but I think there's a lot of legitimacy that comes from within that. Just to answer Stephanie's point about whether real solutions are cover, I guess I feel that we shouldn't devalue cover, that actually to give license to do things which are perhaps more ambitious than politicians or officials might naturally feel comfortable with is actually an incredibly valuable thing. And so if I'm understanding rightly your question, Stephanie, then I would just say, don't devalue the value in people being able to look at the Assembly and point to the Assembly and say, the Assembly asked for this, and therefore we're able to do things. And I think you were also asking a little bit about whether it's real solutions or not. And I guess the other thing I would say is sometimes it doesn't have to be a new and innovative solution that the public are suggesting through an assembly, but the fact that they come behind with a lot of support for something which feels controversial. I think it was Erica perhaps that talked about normalizing things. That sometimes what it does is, for example, say, actually, we're prepared to pay more on tax on this type of food in order to make this type of food cheaper because it has all sorts of other benefits and includes climate change, which was one of our recommendations. And that felt like quite a radical recommendation, but it isn't new. There have been people campaigning for that. But the fact that the population as a whole decided that that was a good thing to do was quite interesting and innovative. And so, yeah, I would say they are real solutions, but maybe not new solutions, and cover is valuable.
I think let's not devalue the value of cover is going to be my favorite quote coming out of this. So Erica, we are running out of time. So what's your final thoughts?
Thank you. I wish we had longer. This is so interesting.
I know, this is great. This is fantastic. I'm really enjoying it.
It's brilliant, isn't it? But so I guess I'll try to answer Bernard's question because it was directly to me, and it is a question that comes up quite a lot about the tension between advocacy on climate and advocacy for democracy. I mean, obviously, yeah, you can't guarantee that these processes are going to kind of come out with what we would, as climate advocates, would want as the climate policies in question. But I think we really recognise that if you don't engage people, it's not going to work anyway. I mean, there comes a limit when you're asking people to change their heating infrastructure or what they eat or how they move or whatever, that if they're not bought into it and they don't feel that they've had part of a say in designing what happens, it's just not going to work anyway. And so you have to try, and actually then the evidence and experience that we have so far seems to be that if you have well-informed people who are given the opportunity to deliberate, they do tend to go in quite a progressive direction, and so actually the two do go sort of hand in hand. but obviously it can't be taken for granted. And otherwise, I think I've been inspired by a lot of what was said, and I also love not devaluing the value of carbon. But I suppose I've also been pleasantly surprised, but also interested by how much of the discussion's been about a sort of more ambitious vision of the evolution of governance in general. So not just, assemblies are a nice thing to do, but really how do we build them into a bigger framework? And, our programme in ECF is about governance, and we have to sort of fight for it from time to time. I often think governance is like air or water, you sort of often don't notice it's there or think about it very much, but if it's not there and it's not working right, by God, you run into trouble. So I think, I guess I call on everybody to keep calling for stronger governance and being bold in what we ask for in relation to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Uffe, do you have any final thoughts or comments? And I'm aware of the time.
Of course I have.
Of course you do, you're a politician.
Just three comments, and two of them is actually more for fun than for serious reflection. Quick. First one is that I think that Scotland should join the Nordic countries. I can really recommend that. Get out of the situation you are in and join the Nordic Council. That was the first one. The second one is that I really like this very quick dialogue, this really good and quick dialogue. I had the feeling that I'm part of a speed dating process, because I would love to keep the contact with everyone who has been on the panel. I was really inspired by you, Susan, about the global perspective, but the same goes with you, Eric, that how can we develop the democratic institutions? And I would really like to learn more from you, Susie, about your experience with the Climate Council Assembly in Scotland. So it has been a really good speed dating process, to say it frankly. The last thing, and that's the more serious part, is that I think everyone should recognize and accept that this is a learning process for everyone, and we're just in the very, very first phase of this learning process about how to understand democracy on a much, much deeper level. And remember that Citizens Assembly is just a tool. It's a really good tool, but there are other tools in the toolbox. And we have also to understand that democracy is not only about a political democracy, it's also about economic democracy. And there are some very, very tough questions we haven't been talking about yet. And if we really want to make a change in the world, we have to ask the very tough questions about power and economic infrastructures and inequality. So that was my serious note. But I think Scotland, join the Nordic Council.
So someone's pointed out in the chat that they already attend the Nordic Council, but I'm actually not going to let Susie say anything because she might put her in an incredibly compromising position to comment on that. So I'm just going to the last person to speak is Susan. So Susan, what's your final thoughts on this discussion?
Thanks, Graham. So I'll try to keep it short and just pick out a few points. So I first want to talk to this idea about public education, comments that were made about institutionalizing, about the legitimacy of citizens' assemblies. And for instance, from our perspective, we didn't have a mandate to run the Global Assembly, right? For instance, there was no global parliament to tell us to run this assembly. Rather, for this year, it was a claimed space. And therefore, we have somehow throughout this process, by running an assembly that was a claimed space, become sort of byproduct experts in what can be called momentum-based movements, right? And so we've had to think about how we solve this accountability problem. How do we institutionalize when there's no clear parliament, for instance, telling us what to do and where to put our outputs in? And so just to speak to a comment that I think someone put in the chat about this need to combine different methodologies. One insight we've had this year is the need to combine this sort of central scale up of a classical citizens assembly model, which is what I've spoken to in today's panel, with other formats like direct democracy. And so a direct output of this was what we call community assemblies, which have also been running in parallel to our core assembly of 100 members since October, and can sort of be organized by anyone around the world to mirror the journey of the core. And this speaks to questions of accountability and sort of the long-term momentum as well, as we are hoping for the community assemblies that are ongoing to be a space that can serve a monitoring and accountability role, but also to work with the outputs that this year's core assembly delivers, and to be able to continue iterating upon them. And so the key point here is viewing the recommendations we get from climate assemblies not as sort of a holy grail and end all, but accepting the possibility for iteration and having methodologies that can support that. And so maybe the one note that I'll end on is just noting that, of course, I'm joining you from Korea, advocating that we can go beyond something electoral democracy, which is, of course, something that many in my parents' generation in this country had dedicated sort of their youth to fighting for. And I'm also only able to advocate for this because of the work they did advocating for electoral democracy. And so I think the sort of realization I'm coming to is that it's very different models, what we are arguing for now, versus what this generation argued for. But the understanding and underlying thread is the same, right? And it's that we can continue to improve and continue to iterate on the ways that we create decisions together as people. And so I'm very happy to have been able to join this panel and speed dating rather, and thanks for everyone who's here.
So look, this has been a really fantastic panel. I'm really sorry to everybody that I've run over, but I actually really enjoyed listening to these four people. So I'm not sorry at all. I'm really glad we've run over. I'd like to thank Uffe. I'd like to thank Susie, Erica, and Susan. I think it's been a really fantastic occasion and a really, really interesting and vitalizing conversation. I'd like to, one thing that Uffe mentioned was he enjoyed the speed dating, he enjoyed getting to know people and want to keep this conversation going. Well, that's precisely what we're trying to do at the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. So if there's one thing you take away to do tonight, please do join the Knowledge Network. It's a place where we're trying to develop an understanding of what works and under what conditions. And hopefully we'll see some of you in our next events. Our next event is actually on the Finnish citizens jury on climate. Oh, sorry, there you go. Oh, finally the slides appeared. So can we move to the next one, actually? Is that all right? We're going to be holding a next learning call will be on the Finnish climate jury on, sorry, start again, I'm tired. The Finnish citizens jury on climate action, which took place last year, and we'll be having lots of other events over the next year, over the next few months. We've got some really interesting knowledge development programs going on at the moment, which are looking, knowledge development projects, which are looking at things like how to land an assembly, looking at questions about how to frame climate. So this is a real place for us to develop a community of practice of policymakers, of practitioners, of activists, of former members, of media, and of philanthropists. And we would love to see you at our future events and to engage with you on this issue of how we can really vitalize climate governance through the use of climate assemblies. It's been a real pleasure. Once again, thanks to my guests, and also thank you to the audience, and good night.